Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Friday, so we are going to continue the series on the great Vladimir Kramnik. We are looking at the Taimanov Sicilian. He played in Krasnodar when he was 10 years old in 1985. And if you showed me this game without telling me the age of the player side, I wouldn't believe you that he is just 10 years old. Okay, so the Krasnodar is, by the way, in southern Russia, near the river Kuban. And his opponent Ramezov is an unknown player. This is the only game from the database. I'm guessing he is from the area, but that's just a guess. Okay, so we have e4, c5, the Sicilian, knight f3, and e6. And the Taimanov Sicilian, this is not the Taimanov yet, this is the French Sicilian, could also be reached via knight c6 on move 2 instead of e6, and now d4, cd, knight d, and e6 is the Taimanov. The funny thing is that after e6, when Kramnik was on the white side of this later on in his life, when he was already a very strong player and the world champion, he would play c4, which is now known as the Kramnik Sicilian, just a forced way to get a Maroczy bind position and basically prevent the move d5 from black, which is one of the main breaks in this position. If d5 is not played, then you can see that this bishop doesn't really have good options, and I've won games because this bishop was still stuck on c8. You can find several in the Road to GM series. Okay, but in the game, d4 was played by his opponent, going for the main line open Sicilian, and now knight c6. And the Taimanov was, of course, named after the great Mark Taimanov, one of the best chess players and one of the best pianists in the Soviet Union, an absolutely remarkable man. As I said, it could be reached via different move orders, and one thing that's very thematic for it, that in the starting position of the Taimanov with knight c6, black isn't giving his cards away yet. He could play several different setups. He could play a6, b5, bishop b7. He could play a6, b5, bishop d7. He could play d5. He could play d6. He could play bishop e7. He could play bishop b4, bishop c5, or bishop b4. And several options here. And after knight c3, one of the ideas of the Taimanov is to play either, as I said, bishop b4 or bishop c5, which is a very aggressive placement for the bishop. You basically don't play bishop e7 in that case. And one of the ways for white to prevent that, which was one of Karpov's favorites, as we are going to see in the Karpov series, was to start with the move knight b5. And this will usually lead to Maroczy bind positions against the hedgehog. And as you can see, white, by not playing... Oh, excuse me. By not playing the move knight to c3, white is keeping the option of playing the move c4 and going for a Maroczy bind. If the knight is placed on c3, then d5 is much easier to play. And now black has to react, because if he does nothing, then knight d6 is just a crushing move. Not so much because it wins the bishop, even though that's important with these dark squared weaknesses, but because the queen will be stuck on d6. Let me just give you an example variation. So a6, which I've actually seen. So here, and takes, and queen takes. And now if you try to get rid of this queen with queen e7, then I could just play the move e5, and your position is just hopeless. You're never going to develop. That's just it. This knight, if you play knight h6, for example, I'll just play g4 eventually. So yeah, knight b5. And against knight b5, as I said, d6 is played same as in the Taimanov Scheveningen systems, and now c4. And this is the Maroczy bind against the hedgehog, which is my favorite position for white. Against the Sicilian, a ton of theory here, so we're not getting into that. Okay, also, after knight to c3, black, as I said, has several options. There are a couple of moves. Knight f6 would transpose into the 4-knight Sicilian. Queen c7 would transpose to a Bastrikov-Paulsen Sicilian. You could say that a6 is the only true Taimanov move, which keeps the position in Taimanov territory. Queen c7 as well, but a6 is the main line Taimanov. And d6 is what was played by Kramnik, and d6 is the Scheveningen small center. Now, let's look at this position. So there are two ways to play against this small center, which could likely end up being a hedgehog with b6, a6, bishop b7, rook c8. One of them is to play for f4, f5, and just try to break open the position if you're trying to win. So that's the most common way. And the other is to play with a Maroczy, and since knight c3 has been played, then you're not doing that. The third way would be to play f3, bishop e3, queen d2, castles queenside, where your light squared bishop isn't as useful as it is against the Najdorfs when the pawn is on e5, because it's biting on this solid pawn chain. And if you don't play bishop c4, bishop b3, as you do in the Yugoslav and stuff like that, then going for a queenside castling leaves your bishop sort of misplaced. Okay, bishop e3 not showing his cards away. Bishop e7. As I said, one of the ideas was to play bishop c5, bishop b4, but Kramnik went for a small center. Okay, knight f6 was the main move instead of bishop e7, but this is also okay. Okay, now bishop to c4, and now we know if a good player was playing white, and we were on the black side of this, bishop c4 actually gives away a ton. After bishop c4, we know white's next moves, but I don't know how many, but probably 4 or 5. So here's what I know white is going to do. White is going to play castles kingside, f4, f5, queen d3, and rook a to e1 or a to d1, and he's going for this attacking setup of breaking my e6 pawn. So bishop c4 is very committal. As I said, if he doesn't play f4, f5, it makes no sense. So let me just give you an example. So knight f6, and let's say white doesn't know what he is doing. He goes for a Yugoslav type setup, English attack setup. So castles and castles queenside. What's this bishop doing here? Okay, so that would be a problem. Okay, after knight f6, knight b3, and we are now in one of the main lines of the Paulsen or Taimanov Sicilian. Castles for Kramnik, castles for white, a6, preventing knight b5 and preparing b5. First you have to defend the knight though, and now f4, and we knew that what white was going to do. That makes a lot of sense. Queen c7 defends the knight, gets away from this. From this file also helps prepare the move e5, which can be played in many variations to undermine white's kingside attack. f5 played, and now in this theoretical variation you exchange on d4 first to get some pressure on the c file. So knight d4, I may sneeze, excuse me, bishop d4, and now you can play bishop d7 or b5. Bishop d7 was played in the game, b5 is the main line, and after b5, a3, rook b8. You can see that white is playing on the king side, black is playing on the queen side, and the position is getting quite sharp. I would just like to mention that we are going to be looking at some highlighted positions. So I'll try to highlight the very instructive points in the game once we get out of theory. Okay, bishop d7 played, queen f3 played, of course helps with the kingside attack. Kramnik continues with b5. Now both sides are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Black tries to crash through on the queen side, white tries to open up the king side. F takes e6, you always take with the f pawn to give yourself the option to play e5, which is very useful. In fact, if the king was on h8, you could play it on the next move. And now white starts his attack, and white is objectively better here. Look at these bishops. The bishops look great, the rook is perfectly placed, the queen is perfectly placed. It's now going to move to h3 to start an attack. The only problem is he has a few weaknesses. e4 is weak, c2 is weak, this diagonal could be weak, so it's not that clear, but for the moment white is better. Queen h3 puts pressure on the e6 pawn. Of course that has to be defended because the bishop would fall. Queen to c8 defense, and now queen to g3, and this doesn't really threaten much because if you take on f6, I have two defenders, so even though my pawn is pinned, that's not a big deal, but Kramnik unpins just in case. e5, okay, and as I said, if white doesn't play e5, let's say he plays rook to e1, then e5 from black would be a very good positional decision. So for example, bishop e3, bishop to e6, and now we basically have to exchange. And in this position, black has absolutely no issues. In fact, I would say he's very close to positionally winning because these three actually are extremely weak. Okay, but white correctly plays the move e5, d5, and queen e5. Okay, and now Of course, you move the knight. I made you, unless you move it to h5. Again, these bishops are monsters. If the rook gets into the game, like rook e1, if the knight reroutes via e5 or something, then the position looks very, very close to crushing. Okay, so queen c6 played by Kramnik, finally connecting his rooks, perhaps trying to play bishop to d6. If white isn't careful, that would be a very good move, improving the knight, the bishop a great deal. Rook a1 finally, and bishop to d6. I think white had to do something about his queen, probably play queen g5 in anticipation of bishop d6. Now queen g5 was provoked by bishop d6. h6, another tempo on the queen. Note that queen g3 may seem like a good idea, but you don't really have time for something like, I don't know, knight e2 in this case, and c3 and bishop c2. You're never really going to mate me, because it will take you a couple of moves to do that. Of course, in an ideal world where I do this and black is not a good player, let's say black just shuffles his pieces around, then fine. This could be a good attacking idea, and now rook takes f6, but yeah, Kramnik is never allowing that. Okay, h6, queen h4. In some positions, if the rook moves, of course, bishop f6, gf6, and takes on h6. And also here, if bishop f6, rook f6, rook f6, gf6, queen h6 would again be winning for white, so black needs to be careful. So Kramnik simply blocks the bishop out with e5. And now I would like to note the first very instructive point in the game. Look at this diagonal. Very often when your opponent has moved his f-pawn, look for tactics along the a7, g1 diagonal, or in black's case, g8, a2, because sometimes it's going to be possible to simply win the position in one move. What you're going to need for that to work, for example, if I'm trying to explain the Greek gift sacrifice, then we would be talking about a knight on f3 and stuff like that. A queen on the original square, and so on. In this case, you need either the bishop or the queen to be able to come to the diagonal, and you need a knight on f6. So this is a very common pattern, and try to remember it. Why? Because the knight from f6 could jump into g4 or e4, and on the next turn it's controlling f2 and h2, and very often that could lead to immediate disaster for the defender. As I said, the first prerequisite is that this diagonal is open. Now, that means that white has to keep the bishop on the diagonal. You shouldn't really move the bishop away. You can play bishop a7, for example, or bishop f2. Bishop a7 is probably best. Okay, and let's say rook to e8, and now you continue with knight e4, and you try to solidify your position, exchange this very strong knight. In the game, black got a losing position after his next move because he didn't think about this tactical problem he had. He took on e5, and this now just loses by force. Kramnik, of course, takes, white takes, and now I would like to invite you to pause the video and just find the win. Okay, so the best move was, of course, played by 10-year-old Kramnik, knight to g4, a tempo on the rook, and threatening knight to f2. Knight f2 in itself is not a problem, but if you have a queen that could come to either b6 or c5, and the king is forced to go to h1, because if the rooks are exchanged, if it goes to f1, queen f2 would be mate, or rook f2. Yeah, and also this rook is just, yeah, the king cannot go to f1. So if white exchanges first, let's look at that. So if rook takes f8 and rook takes f8, what do you do now? Your king is going to have to go to h1, and then you're going to lose material. So I've been looking at two variations. Rook e1, just to save the rook and defend the back rank, simply fails to queen c5 or queen b6. So queen c5, king h1, knight f2, king g1, knight d3, and they just take your rook, and it's all over. And if after rook takes f8, you try queen e7, which may seem like a very good defensive try, because when queen b6 happens, you have queen c5. Then unfortunately for you, I have to move queen b8. And again, I'm attacking your rook. If the rook moves, I'm attacking h2. So, for example, this is what I was looking at to be the best move, knight e4, and now we simply knight takes e5. If rook to h5, yeah, okay, if rook to h5, I think just queen f4 should be very good. I don't see a defense to this. Yeah, I think this is just good enough. Okay, but in the game, rook takes f8 wasn't played. He played rook e to e1, declining a trade, and in this position we have queen to c5 check again winning material, king h1 and knight to f2 check. If you don't take, then again I play knight d3, so rook f2. He took with the queen. You can also take with the rook. Queen takes f2, and now an exchange happens. I don't think you should trade queens when you're material down, but okay. King g1, and now this is the second point I would like to highlight. Once you've infiltrated your opponent's second rank, you want to keep your rook there. So it may seem tactically unsound to play rook to d2, but white's best option is probably to exchange because your rook is too strong. And the third point I would like to highlight is when you have an endgame or a late middle game in which you are an exchange up and your opponent still has one rook, trading off that one rook is very good for you. That would make his position even worse. Now, the tactical reason why you may think this doesn't work is knight to e4. However, after knight to e4, I can play rook e8, and it doesn't work. So knight takes d2. Again, we just trade rooks. And after something like this, black would be easily winning. After rook to d2, you could also play rook e2, and as I said, this would just be much better. Instead, Kramnik played rook b to f8, and now we have knight e4 attacking the rook. The rook has to move anyway. Rook 2 to f4, knight c5 attacking the bishop, bishop to c8. Now, he played bishop c8. I think bishop c6 is better. Again, this doesn't work. Knight e6 just doesn't work because you have rook e8. So you're going to have to take my rook, and I'll take your rook. So after knight c5, he could have played bishop c6. Instead, bishop c8, bishop a2. And this is a very good idea from white. He wants to advance his pawns, and basically this is the only chance he has. Okay, Kramnik plays a5, which is okay. Knight d3 attacks the rook. Rook back to f6, and now c4. And this next point I would like to highlight is the most important one. If you are up material, don't go for a win immediately. Make sure that you don't give your opponent any counterplay. And this is the one point where Kramnik threw his advantage away for no reason at all. I'm sure if this game was played 2 or 3 years later, he would have just kept his nerve and played the best move. And in this position, after c4, you shouldn't allow your opponent to get past pawns. So he could have taken immediately. Instead, he played bishop f5, which is still okay, attacks the knight e5 in this position. And here, it's now this is crucial. In the game, he played b4, which is a huge blunder. Why? For a very simple reason, that it gives white a passed pawn on c4. It may not seem like a big deal now, but after b4, ab, I could have a protected passed pawn, and that's not going to be good for you. Instead of that, after knight e5, he should have just taken. Just b takes c4, bishop takes c4. Fine, I can't lock your pawn structure down with a4 because you have a light squared bishop, but I still didn't give you a passed pawn. It's going to take you one more move. It's going to take you b4. And more importantly, this is the next instructive point. You want your opponent, if he has to have a passed pawn, you want it on a color opposite to his bishop. So you don't want his passed pawn on the c file because he has a light squared bishop. If it's on the b file, then okay, it's much easier to defend. Okay, b4, ab4, c5. Of course, white just pushes his pawn. King h7. I don't really agree with this move, but okay. And in this position is the next instructive point. White made a mistake with g3. Now, black is still winning, but white has tons of counterplay. Without g3, it would have been much easier to play. g3 is a mistake because black Kramnik has a light squared bishop on f5, so just bishop to h3, and now you're hanging checkmates. You're hanging checkmates. So you have to do something. It's already a mate threat. So, for example, bishop c4 would have been a defense, and now rook e8, everything is pinned. b3 defense, but now g5, and you can see that because of this bishop on h3, black is dominating the position completely. Instead, g5, and now we have king g2, preventing bishop h3, rook d8, bishop c4, rook d2 check. And even though white is picking up a couple of pawns, bishop to c4 was a very smart move by Kramnik's opponent. It simply prepares to push the pawn without allowing the rook to get behind it. King f3, rook b2, king e3, rook c2, and now rook to a1. And now the next point, if you've moved your kingside pawns and your second rank is weak, watch out for counterplay. Obviously white has a ton of pieces ready to attack your king, so you have to be pragmatic, you have to play prophylactic moves and try to win later. So rook f8. Rook f8 is good for two reasons. Firstly, you're never getting mated. You might have to give up your rook, but not really. If rook a7, for example, then king h8, knight f7, king g7, it's not really a big deal. For example, knight d6 and king f6, I mean, black is still better, white didn't achieve anything. Okay, the second reason for rook f8 is that you have the move rook e8, attacking the knight. So if white is not careful, he could lose his knight. For example, white plays something imprecise, and here, and game over. Okay, so, oh no, actually you could, wait. I thought I was winning the knight. Yeah, I am winning the knight, because you don't have rook a3. Okay. Instead of that, Kramnik played king g7, which is a mistake, because now rook a7 check, king f8, and now the king is coming in. Your king is cut off. You don't want your king on the back rank. King to d4. His opponent could have played better with rook to b7, which simply prepares to attack the pawn. And now we don't have anything better but to exchange. And this position would actually be a draw with correct play, even though you're an exchange up. Very likely you're going to get a position rook versus knight or rook versus bishop, and it's going to be a draw. Okay, so king to d4 played, rook to d2, king to e3, rook to d1, rook a8 check, king e7, rook a7 check, king to d8. The king is approaching the passed pawn, which is good. c6, rook to c1, attacks the bishop, king to d4, b3, tries to queen his pawn. And now, again, white had a chance to play better. He could have played rook b7, simply stopping the pawn. After bishop takes b3, he just loses a piece. This was just a final blunder. In a position that's very complex and double-edged and could go either way, bishop takes b3, just loses on the spot. He missed that he loses a knight. So pause the video, win the knight, win material, win the game. Okay, so rook d6, of course, and after king e3, rook e1 check picks up the knight, and that will be game over. So I think this was a remarkably complex game for a 10-year-old. I don't know how good Ramazov was. I don't know how old he was, or whether he was a professional player or a club player or a complete amateur. It seems he knew theory. And I think this is the most complicated game I've analyzed in all 7 series on World Champions. I think this was a very good, instructive game. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think. See you tomorrow, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.